Okay, so today we're going to go over a few more evaluating expressions. So make sure you're paying attention because I was seeing a lot of mistakes on the homework. So on problem number 1, the absolute value, you got the absolute value of -2 plus -6 plus -2. So remember, absolute value is the distance from 0. So because you have an addition sign inside the absolute value, right, it's kind of like you have to do what's inside the absolute value first. So we have to actually figure out what is -6 plus -2. And -6 plus -2 is -8. And that's what you guys were writing on your homework. But the problem is we haven't done the absolute value yet. We only did what was inside the absolute value. We still have the absolute value there. And so that should have been everybody's first line. And a lot of you left out the absolute value symbols on that first step. Then we can go ahead and do the absolute value. So now we can go ahead from here to here. We can do the absolute value of -8, which is saying how far is -8 from 0? And we say it is 8 units. So those should be your steps on your paper, right? You have the original problem copied down. We did what was inside the absolute value first, right? We did what was inside the absolute value first. And then we could actually take the absolute value, and then our final answer is 8. Okay, next problem. Remember, that means multiply. So -4 times the absolute value of 3. So there's no operation inside the absolute value, whereas here there was an actual addition symbol. Here on number 2, there's no operation inside the absolute value. So we actually have to do the absolute value first before we can multiply. So how far is +3 from 0? It is 3 units. And then we can multiply. So that should have been your first line, and that should have been your second line. So -12 should have been your final answer, and those should have been your steps. You need to make sure you're showing all the steps. Now look at number 3. Number 3, compare that to number 1. So look at number 1 for a second and look at number 3. What do you notice that's different? Right? In number 1, the addition symbol or operation is inside the absolute values, where in number 3, the operation is between. It's not inside the absolute values, it's between two different absolute values. Right? So you really have to understand the notation. We're trying to get you used to seeing the different expressions and what they mean. So we have to actually do the absolute value of -7 is 7 units from 0. And then how far is 9 from 0? It is 9 units from 0. And then we can do the subtraction. Right? And then 7 minus 9 is -2. So that should have been your first line. This should have been your first line, and this should have been your second line. Okay, now let's look at number 4. On number 4, you guys are still forgetting the parentheses around the base. You must have a parentheses just around the base when you're substituting for an exponential type expression. So you should have had as your first line, you should have had -2 times, and you should have had a parentheses, right? And then in place of B, we're putting -5. And then in place of A, we're putting -3. And a lot of times we'll put that extra parentheses there to keep the addition sign away from the -3. Then we have to do order of operations. So that should have been everybody's first line. Then we have to do order of operations. Order of operations says you must do exponents first. And you guys were making mistakes with your exponents. So remember, off to the side of your paper when needed, you can write out what it means if you need to. If you're forgetting, that means -5 times -5, which is +25. So this is going to be -2. And notice how I'm changing it up and using my dot, and that's 25. just to kind of emphasize that negative 5 squared is 25. We want to make sure that you guys know the order of operations. That's the reason why we want to see the individual steps, right? And then we have to do multiplication. So after that, we need to multiply before we add, right? PEMDAS. And that gives us negative 50. And then we can add and get negative 53 as our final answer. So those should have been your lines that I was looking for, because we said show all steps. So we didn't want you just to show a couple of the steps. We wanted to show all of them. Okay, let's look at number 5. So look at my arrows. This is like step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 4, right? Using the tier method and PEMDAS. So let's look at trying to get my eraser to erase, and it's doing weird things. Okay, let's do number 5. Now number 5 is a square root symbol. So I noticed with your square root symbols, you guys are not being careful with where your square root goes. So on problem number 5, do you think when you substitute, would it be this, or is it this? Because they're both not right. One person is right and the other person is wrong. So which one of those is really correct? If you said the first one, you're right, because the square root goes around the right. The square root symbol goes all the way out to the 6. This one, they don't have the square root. They didn't make it long enough, and that's a big deal. They cut it off, they shortened it, and that means that only the 30 was underneath the radical, and that's not what that says. It says that x plus 6 is under the square root symbol. So you got to make sure that when you're writing that you're extending that square root symbol all the way to where it should be and no more than it should be. So this person had done it incorrectly, and that's a big deal. So you got to really pay attention to that. So let's finish this problem. So then we have to do what's underneath the square root first. So 30 plus 6, just lost my, 30 plus 6 is 36, right? Then we can actually take the square root of 36 and get 6. Some of you are leaving out your square root symbol, right? You were leaving out your square root symbol. You got to do the square root and keep the square root there until you've done everything under the square root. So some of you are leaving that out. So this is what your line should look like. This should have been line 1, this should have been line 2, and this should have been line 3. Okay, let's look at number 6. Number 6 is another square root symbol. But notice how far that square root symbol actually goes, right? How far does it actually go? Is the 5 under the square root symbol, or is the 5 outside of the square root symbol? So is this correct? And then we're supposed to put a 9 in place of x. Or is this correct? Right? Which one of those is correct? Because one is right and one is wrong. If you said the first one's incorrect, that one is wrong, because the square root symbol only goes to the x. The plus 5 is outside of the square root symbol, right? The plus 5 is outside the square root symbol. So it's super important that you guys are paying attention to those little details. Mathematics is very detail oriented. So we have something that we're adding underneath or outside. So that original problem is outside. So this is what your work should look like. And I don't know why my eraser's not working. Okay, so here's what your work should look like. So your work should look like that you should have square root of 9 plus 5, and then the square root of 9 is 3, and then 3 plus 5 is 8. So that's what your final answer should look like, right? Square root of 9 plus 5 should be your first line. Then you can take the square root of 9, which is 3, and then you can add the 5. Okay, it's starting to get tired because I've been doing a lot of videos. Let's look at number 7. Notice number 7 has a negative out in front of the x squared. So remember what we said earlier. We said if you are substituting into an exponential, you should always have a parentheses around just the base, right? So notice that there's a negative out in front of that. So when we cut, our first line should be negative, and then we should have a parentheses squared plus, and then we're going to put 3 where the x used to be. So that's what everybody's first line should look like. And now we have to do order of operations. Notice that 3 is the only thing that's in the parentheses. So the 3 is the base. So we have to do the 3 squared. And 3 squared means 3 times 3, which is 9, right? So 3 times 3 is 9, and then we have that negative sitting out in front of there, so we have to recopy that negative, right? And then we have plus 3, and then negative 9 plus 3 is negative 6. So negative 6 is your final answer. So you really have to understand the difference between those, and we're trying to get you to start to introduce all those different notations, right? So we had to copy the negative that was in front of there, and then we had to do 3 squared because order of operations, we had to do exponents first. Okay, let's look at number 8. So notice number 8 is another problem, just like the one we just did a little bit ago. Maybe you can hit pause. Maybe you can try to write the first line and see how you do writing the first line. So what would the first line look like? So hit pause. Did you remember to put the parentheses around just the base? So you should have a negative and then a parentheses around the base squared plus, so we're going to put a negative 4 where the x used to be, and because we have a plus sign and we have a negative number, we like to put that extra parentheses to keep that addition sign a little bit away from that negative sign. So we like to put an extra parentheses there to keep those two symbols away, right? So that's what your first line should look like. You should have had a parentheses around just the base. Some of you are putting your parentheses around the whole thing. You shouldn't put your parentheses around the whole thing, just the base. Now we have to do order of operations. Order of operations says you have to do exponents first. So we have to do negative 4 squared. Notice there's that extra negative sitting outside of there, right? So we have to do negative 4 squared first. And remember that negative 4 squared means negative 4 times negative 4, which is positive 16. So this is positive 16. And then we still have this negative sitting out in front of here that we have to recopy. And then we got plus a negative 4. And then negative 16 plus a negative 4 is negative 20. And that's your final answer. So those should have been your steps. Right? So pay attention to those different lines. Right? So you have to do the negative 4 squared first. Let's look at the next problem. Number 9. Number 9, I noticed that we're really struggling with something like this. So remember that when you have a number next to a variable and there's nothing there, that means multiply. And I don't want you to use an x for multiplication. I want you to show us that you know the proper notation as we get to higher level mathematics, that we stop using the x because we tend to use X is for variables. So I need to know that you understand the proper notation. So you have a choice. You can either write 3 times A, right? Or you can, without the parentheses, so you can write 3 times -8, or you can put a parenthesis. So we usually just use a parenthesis for multiplication. So we've got 3 and then times -8 divided by -4 plus, and b is being replaced with -2. So that should be everybody's first step. Notice I haven't done really any math. All I've done is replace the a and the b, the variables, with their numbers, and using correct notation to show multiplication and to keep the addition sign away from the negative signs. We use that extra parentheses there. So we're trying to make sure that you guys understand how to use your notation. Then we just have to calculate the numerator, right? So the numerator is the top expression. So remember, that means 3 times -8, and 3 times -8 would give us -24 in the numerator. And then we have to figure out the denominator. The denominator is the bottom expression. And what is -4 plus a -2? -6. So that should be everybody's second line. And then you guys are doing reducing techniques that maybe you learned from last year, which is okay, but I really need you guys just to recognize that this is just now a division fact problem. It's just a regular division problem that says -24 divided by 6. And -24 divided by 6 is 4. And then when the signs are the same, right? And then when you have the same signs, it's going to be a positive. And we normally don't write the positive symbol there, but you have to remember your rules. So that should be your final answer. So those are the steps that we would expect to see. And then this is your final answer, right? So make sure that you're just doing the numerator, doing the denominator, and then doing your division, and that's just a division fact problem. 24 divided by 6. We should all know our division facts. Let's try another one of those. So I did like 3 of those because we were really struggling with those. So here's another one of those. So we substitute using correct notation. So we've got a -3 plus 21, and then remember that means multiply. So I'm going to use a 2 parentheses, -3. So that should be everybody's first step. Then we're just going to figure out what the numerator is by doing -3 plus 21. And -3 plus 21 is +18. And then we're going to do the denominator's expression. The denominator expression says 2 times -3. And 2 times -3 is -6. So that should be everybody's second line. And then it's just a division fact. It's just an 18 divided by 6 fact, right? Those are just your division facts that we've been practicing. So 18 divided by 6 is 3. And then when the signs are different, right, positive divided by negative is going to be a negative. So your final answer is -3. So those are your 3 lines. Right, let's look at the next one. I think this is the last one. Number 11. So once again, just the first line should just be the substitution step. So we have -5 is being multiplied, right? Because this means multiplication. So that means to multiply. So I used a parentheses to show multiplication. So -5 times 6 divided by 10. So that should be everybody's first line. Then we're going to figure out what the numerator is, right? So -5 times 6 is -30. And then I'm recopying the denominator because there's nothing left. So that should be everybody's second line. And then it's just a regular division problem, right? It's just a 30 divided by 10 problem, just a regular division fact. So 30 divided by 10 is 3. And then the signs are different, right? A negative divided by positive is going to be a negative 3. So that should be your last step. So remember, you can go back and watch this again. You can pause it and you can try the problems again. Make sure you're writing the notation. Do your homework. Make sure you're checking your answers. Alrighty. See you later.